Chapter 205, Suleiman Shot. Tuesday, June 4, 1996, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Jerusalem, Horcruxes left. 1. Cup, Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 3, the Cone Gadol shook John Paul Eyre's hand warmly. Thank you for coming, Holiness. I apologize for the short notice. The Pope smiled. Don't worry about it. I figure your mission takes priority. You're ostensibly my boss now, and when ghosts of biblical legends start telling you that the world is about to blow up, I listen. Deborah came to you, didn't she? Yes, Holiness. She said something about God giving up any hope that we're redeemable, and that unless we did something drastic, God would have no problem in sitting back and let us destroy ourselves. The Cone Gadol grimaced. That's about what Samuel said to me. He said that although God himself promised Noah that he himself wouldn't destroy the world once again, he did not rule out having us destroy it for him. That was my interpretation as well. Considering that the whole world is coming to pieces around us, it is more important than ever that we start high-level discussions as soon as possible for unifying the three Abrahamic faiths. We have to convince God, or at least Samuel, that we deserve another chance. Have you seen any sign of Samuel or Deborah since they delivered this ultimatum? No, Holiness, and it's starting to worry me more and more. Samuel has been trying to meddle everywhere ever since he showed up at that ghost conference in New York. The fact that he's suddenly disappeared without a trace is very unnerving. I suspect God has ordered him back because it was useless to continue the fight. The Pope shuffled his feet. That's what I'm concerned about as well. I don't know about you, but everyone who's spoken with me is nervous. Monks have been praying around the clock. There are still people who believe that either Travis Radner, Urban Roman 8, or I must be the false prophet, and that Voldemort has to be the Antichrist. Even worse, judging from what's been happening in North Korea, it's almost believable. There are only so many sermons preaching world peace that one can give before it starts to fall on deaf ears. The Cone Gadol looked resigned. I've been preaching world peace as well and encouraging Christians and Jews to worship at the mosque. For the most part, the worshippers are getting along quite well. There are a few hotheads here or there, but I feel like unifying the faiths is doable, Holiness. We have so much tradition in common. The Pope drew a deep breath. I sure hope it's doable, or we're in big trouble. Amen to that. How have your relations with the Celestines been? John Paul winced. Not good. They refuse to speak to me, instead going through the papal nuncio. They say that I need to step down, and if I don't step down they'll declare a crusade against wizards and take me out with their first blow. The Cone Gadol thought about it. Maybe you should step down. I can't, Holiness, as it would imply that Urban Roman 8 has won. The man is a bigot, Suleiman, and I can't let him win as it would be defamation of God's name. Celestine Roman 6 is a saintly man. I know him well. If there was anyone deserving of becoming an antipope, it was he. Urban, on the other hand, is going to be a problem. He has completely warped the teachings of Jesus into policies which could only be appropriate for a witch hunt. It's not just about icons anymore. There are doctrinal differences on witch laws, evolution, the Latin Mass, everything. Do you want me to take over, or Celestine? The Pope looked at all the people prostrated on the floor of the mosque. Some were wearing tefillin, and some were wearing crosses. The vast majority, of course, were wearing Muslim garb. He never thought he'd see such a sight, and it filled him with pride and awe. It was a beginning, he thought, but only a beginning. He wished Samuel could have seen this. He turned back to the Cone Gadol and shook his head. They won't accept you because you're a Muslim. I can tell you that straight out. As for me stepping down and letting Celestine succeed me, I'm thinking about it. The problem is that Samuel won't. The Pope's comments were suddenly cut off by a scream from outside the mosque. Frowning, both religious leaders turned to look into the main sanctuary. Many of the men had turned to face the back of the room. Without warning, one of the Jewish worshippers' heads exploded in a spray of blood. The man collapsed, twitching uncontrollably, to the floor of the sanctuary as an ominous shout echoed throughout the building. Muslims for humans. It took a good 5 seconds for the Cone Gaddle to figure out why the Muslims would have attacked their own shrine. They weren't after the Muslims, he realized. They were after the Jews and Christians. They were trying to purify the dome of the rock from the touches of the infidels. If they realized that John Paul Roman II, a known wizard, was here and was speaking to a man whose position as Cone Gaddle had been imposed by a wizard. Even worse, the Cone Gaddle had betrayed the true faith by letting infidels worship in the sanctuary. He spun to face the Pope just as a man with a cross was shot between the eyes. "I'm going down there. I'm not letting this abomination defile the temple. Do you have your wand? Are your guards here?" John Paul reached into his robes and pulled out a wand. "The guards are here, Suleiman, and I'll be able to defend myself. However, you must realize that I will not use magic as a weapon. The sight of the Pope attacking Muslims would likely send shockwaves around the world. All I will do is cast spells to protect people." The Cone Gaddle nodded. "Good, let's go and confront our demons." The sight of the Pope and Cone Gaddle racing down the stairs side by side drew cries of shock and surprise from the Muslim for humans fanatics. There were about 10 of them, all armed with guns. He had no idea how they had managed to get through security, but they had. He had a suspicion that one of the guards could have been a Muslims for humans sympathizer. There wasn't much he could do about that now, though he made a mental note to figure out who that was once this crisis was over. That brief moment of surprise had been all that the Pope needed. Bringing out his wand, he created a force field separating the attackers from the worshippers. Meanwhile, the Pope's Swiss guards, having lost a couple of seconds due to surprise on their own part, arrived and turned their weapons on the attackers. All 10 men fell to the ground, dead. As the Cone Gaddle worked, something odd occurred to him. All of the attackers were men. Granted, no pious Muslim woman would enter the men's section. The men's section. The Cone Gaddle suddenly froze in horror. No one was watching the women's section, and if the Pope was busy here. He glanced towards the women's section and saw movement out of the corner of his eye. A gun flashed, and a bullet hit the Cone Gaddle in the chest. The Pope spun, re-raising the shields around him, and the Cone Gaddle as soon as he heard the gunshot. He had lowered the shields once he had blocked off the Muslims for humans attackers. He watched in horror as Suleiman collapsed. Furious, he cast Expelliarmus in the direction of the gunshot. There was a high-pitched shout of surprise, and a pistol flew out the women's section and landed a few feet away from the Cone Gaddle's fallen body. Some gunshots in the distance marked the Swiss guards taking out the female attackers. John Paul cast a healing spell on the fallen imam while ordering the Muggle doctors to treat the other victims. The bleeding stopped, but the man was still in jeopardy. The Pope scanned the gunshot victim once again and saw that the man had a collapsed lung with the bullet stuck in it. He was in dire straits and needed help immediately. He didn't know how to heal a collapsed lung with magic. This had to be done by a trained Emt. Worshippers and Swiss guards surrounded the Pope as he did what he could to help the Cone Gaddle. He cast a couple of more spells to stabilize the injured man's condition as much as he could. Finally, Suleiman's eyes opened. "John Paul, if I don't make it, make sure the conference comes to pass. Unify the faiths. It is the will of God." The Pope cradled the injured man. "Hold on, Suleiman, hold on." The Cone Gaddle did in fact hold on. Half an hour later, he was in the hospital and undergoing emergency surgery. The doctors were amazed at what the Pope had done and were convinced that John Paul had saved the man's life. His secretary Ibrahim would serve as acting Cone Gaddle while Suleiman was convalescing. When asked to choose a regnal name, Ibrahim declined, saying that he did not deserve to be Cone Gaddle and that Samuel had never anointed him. He would still go by Ibrahim and not take advantage of his new position. Only time would tell if this incident would galvanize 3 religions into ending almost 2,000 years of bloodshed. Chapter 206, Elder Wand Gambit. Wednesday, June 5, 1996 Durmstrang Institute Sweden Horcruxes left. 1. Cup Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 3 Deputy Headmaster Stanislav Drakel stood at the podium in the Great Hall of Durmstrang. Much to his surprise, Headmaster Karkaroff had survived and was working to overthrow Voldemort as a member of the Order of the Phoenix. Drakel wished him well and believed that Igor would be a great asset to the good wizard's cause. However, he had nearly fallen over when he had received his most recent letter from Karkaroff. He thought he had misread it and looked it over a couple of more times. It seemed to be saying what he had thought Karkaroff was saying. Voldemort was in charge of North Korea and could be on the verge of unleashing a wave of dark magic all across the world. Durmstrang was one of the few wizarding schools which focused on dark magic as a specialty, including both offensive and defensive spells. This put Durmstrang's graduates in an excellent position for dealing with dark wizards. Karkaroff and Drakel both took pride in the school's traditions and expertise in this area. Yet if this document was saying what he thought it was, Karkaroff believed it was time to put those skills into practice. He was recommending that all wizards 17 and above, and optionally wizards of age 16, be drafted into summer lessons to prepare them into become a standing army which would protect the world against Voldemort and any future dark wizards. Now that the statute of secrecy was gone, the temptation for a wizard to take control of Muggle nations, which Voldemort had already done, would be extremely powerful, especially before Muggles realized what wizards could and could not do. The letter included a sample lesson plan derived from the classes developed from Dumbledore's army. Drakel was amazed at what the students were learning up there. Karkaroff had warned him, however, that these were not official classes and that they would likely not be in session for long. If these lessons were to be maintained long-term, they would have to be taught at Durmstrang. He agreed to adding the new techniques, including Muggle self-defense tactics, to the school's program immediately, and ordered that students spend an extra month getting up to speed on these new spells. He was reluctant, however, to send any of students into battle against Voldemort. He loved each and every one of his students. He didn't like the idea of sending them into harm's way. Unfortunately, Karkaroff was right. If he didn't get rid of Voldemort now, Voldemort would likely come to him with a vengeance. So here he was, standing in front of the school, about to give a speech which would draft all wizards age 17 and up, and optionally recruit all people of age 16. Classes would be terminated early this year, so the teachers could join the army if they wished. Karkaroff would be visiting Durmstrang in a few days to help start up the first Dumbledore's army program outside Britain. He had mentioned the program to a few Swedish wizards, and they were all ready to join. If Voldemort was indeed going to try to take over the world, he would have to get through many people in order to do so. Dumbledore had told him horror stories about the First Wizarding War. Many of the events that transpired during that war were in fact horrible. However, there were no Muggles involved, and virtually the entire war was restricted to the British Isles. This Second Wizarding War would be far more deadly. At the rate things were going, it could escalate into World War Roman III with wizards, nukes, or both. Drawing a deep breath, he started his speech. For the next 20 minutes, students listened attentively and slowly began to nod their heads. Finally, he reached the end and asked volunteers to raise their hands. No one raised their hands at first. Drakel was about to chastise the students for their cowardice when the back door opened and a tall, muscular wizard walked into the room. It was Victor Crumb, age 18, with a top-of-the-line Quidditch broom in his hand. Silently, he walked to the podium and raised his hand. The man looked about as determined as he did during a World Cup match. Reaching out with his right hand, the Triwizard contestant dropped his broom on the floor and put his left hand on his wand. He then announced, "I volunteer." That opened the floodgates. Hands went up all over the room. Drakel was stunned by the students' response. None of the 17-year-olds had complained, and a good 90% of the 16-year-olds had joined. He'd even been forced to turn back a good 60% of the 4th and 5th-year students on the grounds that they were likely not experienced enough to be a good soldier. What was even more amazing was the fact that the word had gone out via owls, and a good half of the students' families had volunteered to join the army. Most of them were experienced wizards now, and the vast majority had been taught at Durmstrang. He would probably have at least 700 people fighting Voldemort. He took down everybody's names and sent the list to Karkaroff. He was about to leave when another owl swooped into the owlery and landed next to him. There was a package in its beak with his name on it and a letter from Albus Dumbledore. Drackle reached for the letter and opened it. Dear Deputy, Headmaster Drackle. As you know, Headmaster Karkaroff and I are working diligently on plans to remove Voldemort from power in North Korea. We are going to focus on magical solutions to this problem and leave the Muggles to deal with mundane solutions. What I am about to tell you is considered top secret. If anyone finds out other than possibly Dialynis, we are going to have big problems. First, a bit of background. You may have heard of the tale of the three brothers. I have reason to believe that this old wives' tale is in fact true. You see, the Elder Wand actually exists, and I am its master. We have reason to believe that Voldemort is looking for the Elder Wand in order to increase his power. It is only a matter of time until he finds it, as his spies are almost certainly everywhere. However, I know something about the Elder Wand which may work to our advantage. Mastership of the Elder Wand is transferred between people through murder and subjugation. That is, you become the wand's master by killing or subduing its prior one. The important thing is that such an act must be done without using magic, as any attempt to duel the wand's master magically will inevitably fail because the Elder Wand, wielded by its master, will defeat any opponent. Otherwise, it will behave much like any other wand. One of the side effects of this is that if a person holding the wand, who is not the wand's true master, tries to attack the true master with the wand, the attack will backfire and strike the caster. I am the wand's master, and I am going to be joining the coalition against Voldemort. Here is what I am thinking. In this package is the Elder Wand. I want you to place it somewhere in Sweden where Voldemort might be able to find it. Since he is not the wand's true master, he will not actually be able to do anything unusual with it. When it comes time to attack Voldemort, I will argue that it doesn't make any sense for hundreds of wizards to kill each other. Instead, I will challenge Voldemort to a duel to the death. Voldemort, thinking his wand is invincible, will accept. He will then attack me and destroy himself in the process. I know it's a gamble. However, consider it. In a fight like this, we need all the help we can get. If you choose to go along with this plan, hide the wand and send back a message telling us where you put it. If you think it's too dangerous, state your reason and return the wand along with that note. Although it's your decision, I urge you to go along with it. As long as I myself am not killed, which I highly doubt will happen, as I, quite frankly, am one of the most powerful wizards on the planet, there is no chance of the wand's mastership passing to a Death Eater. I look forward to your favorable response. Sincerely, Albus Dumbledore. Chapter 207, Pitmoss on Trial. Monday, June 10, 1996, 10 days to Judgment Day, 169 South Street, Waltham, Massachusetts, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 1. Cup. Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 3, the opening headline on the morning news broadcast said it all. Quabbin water safe to use. Finally, I thought. No more water restrictions. Although they mentioned that drought-level conservation policies would be in effect until the reservoir refilled, for instance, limited watering of gardens and lawns, people could use it for bathing, drinking, and showering once more. Dealing with the water shortages had been difficult. I had slowly gotten accustomed to showering only once a week. What I hadn't gotten accustomed to, however, was the fact that people who didn't shower often tended to smell pretty bad. Deodorant had flown off the shelves as soon as it came in. Granted, even nobles back in the 15th century didn't shower often and didn't have a problem with it, but their society didn't have as much of a fetish for cleanliness as ours did. Many of the restaurants in Waltham had gone out of business. Cappy's Pizza at the intersection of South Street and Turner Street near Parametric had managed to survive by the skin of its teeth. Granted, its food wasn't all that great, but it was one of the lucky ones. A good half of the places on Moody Street had folded, especially chains which figured that they could sacrifice one or two places and not have it make a dent in their profits. Early on, right after the attack, restaurants had tried to survive by taking water out of the Charles and boiling it. Unfortunately, there were things people threw into the Charles, almost certainly illegally, which still managed to pollute the water even after it was boiled. Cambridge was bursting at the seams, as people were trying to escape from the areas with the water shortages into the sole city with a functional water supply. Although Cambridge had promised to let the rest of the state use its water, the fact remained that Cambridge got the lion's share of the fresh pond reservoir supply. They had experienced waterless days only once a week instead of the customary 6. House and condo prices in Cambridge, already sky-high, went into the stratosphere. Studios were going for $1,800 per month, and one-bedrooms were topping $2,300. The young adult community, which had grown up around MIT and Harvard, was in the process of being forced out of the city and being replaced by frantic homeowners from places like Wellesley and Weston. Several Brandeis students who were thinking of moving to Cambridge, such as Erica Schultz, were finding that they were stuck in Waltham for the foreseeable future. Brandeis students were losing weight in a hurry, forced to import water and in some cases food from places like Northampton and Providence instead of the local shores. The food services division, the meal prices had gone up drastically. A typical lunch which had cost $4 suddenly cost $7.50. The Stein Bar and Restaurant had raised its prices to over $10 for a fish sandwich. As if that hadn't been bad enough, the kosher kitchen had once been desperate enough to bring an unauthorized product into the building to try to service a lot of people in a hurry. The kitchen had lost its kosher license for a couple of weeks, putting all of the students who kept strictly kosher, and I knew many of them, in a real bind. Many of them inevitably wound up going to Harvard and Mitt Hillel for food. Judging from what I recalled of the typical non-Friday night Mitt Hillel meals, I hoped that they would be all right with simple cold cuts. Many people had tried to drink water from the Charles or the harbor and had gotten sick. The hospitals were filled with people with diarrhea and other gastrointestinal ailments. One poor fellow who had forgotten to boil his water wound up dying when some parasite in the water began interpreting his digestive system as a food source. Well, we didn't have to worry about water anymore. The faucets were on, and they were on for good. It was time to take a long shower for the first time in a month. The news continued, and the announcer mentioned that the Pitmos trial was finally underway. There had been some haggling over whether Pitmos had to be tried by a wizarding tribunal or by a Muggle court, and eventually the wizarding tribunal had won out. Unlike in Muggle courts, where photography and recording was prohibited, the wizards encouraged Muggles to see their world and welcomed Muggle camera crews. Besides, both Muggles and wizards had been killed in this attack. Normally, Pitmos would have been tried by the Supreme Court of the American wizarding community. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court had been in the town of Dana, which meant that it was currently inhabited by fish which weren't particularly interested in conducting a trial. The trial had therefore been moved to the Smoky Mountain facility, the regional wizarding headquarters for the Mid-Atlantic. The courtroom looked like something out of the Thomas Covenant series. Glowing green orbs of light illuminating the room and a stern man in a wig presiding over the court. The reporters indicated that they felt depressed, cold, and sad, as if all joy had been leached out of their lives. The wizards explained that it was due to the presence of a creature known as a dementor, which was invisible to Muggles. The trial nearly ended before it began. As soon as Pitmoss entered the room, no fewer than 6 people shot green bolts at him. They crashed into a thick plastic screen protecting him from the crowd, and the judge banged his gavel and told everyone that he was innocent until proven guilty. Granted, there was no way in hell that he was going to be found innocent, but formalities had to be observed here. The judge warned that if the trial had any irregularities, he would be forced to release the prisoner and order a new trial. The idea of Pitmoss running around once more silenced the wizards in a hurry, and the trial continued without further interruptions. Most of the Muggles wanted Pitmoss sentenced to the death penalty. The judges explained, although that was an option, there was something even worse which Pitmoss could be subjected to. He didn't want to ruin the surprise, however, and said that he'd say what it was after the trial was over. Oddly enough, the reporters all remarked that the room had gotten even colder, more depressing, and more frightening a few seconds after he made the announcement. Even though there had been no visible change in the atmosphere, the news went on after that with the traditional fires, car accidents, and so forth. Countries around the world were issuing sanctions against the wizard in North Korea. Israeli tanks were chasing Hamas all over the West Bank, and the first few operations had been conducted in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda. Most of the attacks so far had been ineffective, as the wizards and troops had scattered as soon as the threat became obvious. This would be a long, hard-fought battle. Finally, someone had sued a British citizen named Harrison Cooper for, of all things, biting him on a cruise ship. I couldn't help but chuckle at that. One person bit another. What could this Cooper have had? Rabies. The Red Sox had 174, and it would be sunny with a high of 71. Big deal. I turned off the TV and headed to the bathroom to take a shower. As it turned out, I would have to wait a good 2 or 3 days for my long shower. So many people had been thinking the same thing I had, taking long showers at the same time, that the water pressure had dropped to the point where almost no one could shower at all. Chapter 208, Gateway to the Aristocracy. Wednesday, June 12, 297 AG, 1996 AD, 8 days to Judgment Day. An Island Laputagaliver Consortium Horcruxes left. 1. Cup. Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 3 Lone Palt was the talk of the town. A third of the people wanted to kill him, a third of the people wanted to take him out for dinner, and a third of the people wanted to move in with him. Most of the people in the first group were those whose houses had been ruined once again by the flood. They had immediately started complaining that if he knew how to prevent the water from getting in, why didn't he save their houses as well? Lone tried to explain that he wasn't sure that it was going to work to begin with, but for some reason that didn't help. All he could do was offer to help with the magic to clean out their basements. The rest of the people whose houses had been damaged were offering to pay him large numbers of galleons to rent them rooms in his house while their houses were being cleaned up. Lone had to turn most of them down because he simply didn't have enough space to house them all. How could he admit one person and not another? Eventually, he was forced to prioritize the potential tenants by requiring that he visit each of their houses so that he could make sure to admit the people whose houses had suffered the worst damage. He didn't think that renting out some of the extra guest rooms would be much of a hassle. The house had several extra rooms now that his wife had left him and had taken the kids with her. Although the extra income would be useful particularly for alimony settlements, the sheer fact was that half of these people were slobs. One man had turned his daughter's former bedroom into a bachelor pad where he left junk all over the floor. Lone was a bit of a neat freak and delicately asked the tenants to clean up after themselves, otherwise he'd be raising their rent. That helped tidy the house in a hurry. Several Lapitan news broadcasters had visited his house and had congratulated him on keeping out the water. He said that the spell was easy and that he would be able to teach it to other people once he got it perfected. When asked if he thought that the spell would be able to deal with a 100-year flood, he said that he thought it would work, but didn't know for sure. Hopefully, he would never get a chance to test this hypothesis. He had initially considered teaching people the water-repelling spell for a small fee. This, of course, had been a mistake as word had leaked out, and one of the priests started complaining that he should be doing this as a public service. Taken aback, Lone had immediately retracted the fee. He figured he'd be able to make money off his new tenants, at least. Cooking was soon going to be an issue. He could geminio food, of course, but half of the people had dietary restrictions, so he couldn't make one course for all of them and duplicate it to his heart's content. This was a time he really wished he had his wife around. He was busy roasting a leg of chicken when he heard a commotion outside his house. Dropping the chicken back in the oven, he looked up. What he saw made his eyes widen, and he dropped to one knee. Hovering in the air a few dozen feet away was the golden carriage of the high priest of Laputa. It was drawn by 6 Pegasi and 2 Thistrals. The Thistrals supposedly were there to remind the high priest that ruling Laputa wasn't all fun and games. Granted, Lone couldn't see the Thistrals, and supposedly the high priest couldn't either. However, the fact that there were blatantly obvious gaps in the train between 2 of the unicorns made it obvious something was there. The door to the carriage opened, and someone kicked out the ruby stairs. A few seconds later, the high priest stepped out of the carriage. Utler Roman III was almost 6 feet tall and in his late 50s. He had gone prematurely bald, but like many high priests, he considered it inappropriate to glorify his body through magic when he could be working to help Laputa. Lone suddenly felt uncomfortable. He had a strong suspicion who Utler wanted to talk to. His suspicion was confirmed when His Excellency and his bodyguards walked over to him and bade him to rise. How the hell was he supposed to talk to the ruler of the realm? Lone stood and bowed deeply. "Good afternoon, Your Excellency. How can I help you?" Utler shook his hand. "I've come to offer you congratulations and a possible job offer. From what I've been hearing, you've managed to develop a spell which will help protect our homes from these floods as the sea level rises." Lone bit his lip. Delicately, he said, "Your Excellency, I'm flattered. However, I have no idea how well this will work against larger floods. For all we know, we will all start relying on this charm only to find that when the big one hits it will collapse and catch us all unawares." The high priest smiled. "Well, something's better than nothing, and we may have time to prepare for the big one. Now to my offer. Would you be willing to surround Lergib City with a force field similar to the one you used for your house? You'll probably have to move to the capital to maintain it, I'd think. If that becomes necessary, I'll pay for any relocation fees." Lone didn't know what to say. "Your Excellency, I'm flattered." Utler cut in again. "Oh, and did I mention that if the shield survives the next flood, you'll be elevated to the first level of priesthood?" Lone stared at him. The priesthood, known in other cultures as the aristocracy, had most of the power in Laputa, and were among the few people who would ever get the chance to interact with Muggles. Several high-ranking priests served as representatives for Laputa in the Gulliver Senate, where they hobnobbed with giants from Brobdingnag, fairies from Lilliput, and other races. A first-level priest wouldn't be able to do much of that. It was roughly equivalent to a European knight. However, it would get him into the upper class and make him eligible for future promotions. This was a very good deal. Smiling at the high priest, he bowed. "Your Excellency, I'll take it." The high priest thanked him profusely and escorted him to the golden carriage. Or at least tried to, as hundreds of people started screaming him to protect their houses before he left. Chapter 209, 7 Hills. Thursday, June 13, 1996, 7 days to Judgment Day City of 7 Hills Mountains of Afghanistan Horcruxes left. 1. Cup Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 3, there was a flash of light, and Arif Kuri rematerialized in the mountains of Afghanistan. The time had to come to test Voldemort's theory that an engorgio/compressio sequence would successfully generate a nuclear explosion. They had spent a few days going over the map, determining where and when to perform the test. Curie had issued several strict guidelines for determining ground zero. First, the area within 10 miles of the site had to be uninhabited. Killing Afghans would just earn Al-Qaeda and likely Voldemort, another enemy. Second, the wind had to be blowing in a direction which would take the fallout far away from any populated areas. Finally, the explosion had to take place in a location which would contain the blast and prevent the shock wave from striking the Al-Qaeda agents in case Voldemort had underestimated the device's yield. After several hours of preparation, the device was ready. The Al-Qaeda operatives had melted down the little sliver of uranium and formed it into a ball, a shape appropriate for compression. The ball had responded nicely to an Engorgio Minimus spell, doubling in size, but still remaining well under critical mass. Reverting the uranium core back to its original size, the team attempted a Compressio Minimus. The little ball shrank to half its former size, but its mass didn't change. Its density had increased, just as Voldemort had predicted. Finally, the team combined the Engorgio Minimus and Compressio Minimus. The ball's size stayed the same, but its mass had increased by a factor of 8. The results looked promising. The test site turned out to be the location of a small, abandoned ghost town. An old sign painted on a fallen wall read, "Welcome to Seven Hills Mine." Curie looked around the area, trying to find 7 hills. There weren't 7 hills. However, there were 7 mountains visible from his vantage point. The town had lain in a valley surrounded by these peaks. Curie knew that Muggles were always trying to extract bizarre minerals from mountains, and judging from the equipment left in the deserted city, this was a former mining camp. He had a vision of someone shouting he'd discovered gold. 500 people rushing to this location, and a few months later 500 people leaving the town when they realized there wasn't enough gold to make extraction profitable. The fact that there was a deserted town near ground zero would also be helpful. He would be able to see firsthand how buildings would fare against a weapon of this size. He suspected that 7 hills would be wiped off the map, completely destroyed by the blast. Although the terrorists' calculations indicated that some of the buildings on the outskirts would not be vaporized, the fact that they were half collapsed to begin with didn't bode well for their survival. Bringing his thoughts back to the moment, he hurried to the center of town, where the team was gathered around a small knapsack. Inside the knapsack was the uranium sphere. Curie had insisted that the test be conducted in precisely the same manner that it would have had this been an actual mission against a Western target. The terrorist would deliver the weapon to the target using a knapsack or portkey, and the sphere would be encased in lead to ensure that no harm came to the carrier. Once the device was in place, the wizard would apparate in and start the detonation sequence. Once the bomb was armed, the wizard would clasp the carrier's hand and apparate them both to safety before the timer expired. True to form, an agent had delivered the sphere to 7 hills in a knapsack. Normally, he would have done so alone. However, since this was a test and no one knew what the device would actually do, if anything, a whole team of people had set up video cameras which would record the blast. Some of the cameras were mounted on top of the peaks surrounding the doomed town. Others were mounted outside the cordon hills. The man who had carried the bomb nodded and turned to Curie. "Well, I think we're all set. The wind seems to blowing in the right direction, and the helicopter doesn't see anyone in sight. I'd say it's a go. It's your call, however. You're the wizard. We can't do it without you." Arif nodded and turned to face the rest of the terrorists. "May Allah grant us success today. Gentlemen, we proceed. Have everyone other than Rashid and me board the helicopter and get out of here. You know where the base camp is set up on the far side of that mountain, 12 kilometers away, where we will be protected from the shock wave to some extent, and we won't be hit by the burst of light. Everyone dive into the ditch as soon as they get out of the chopper. Close your eyes. Lie on the ground and put your hands over your heads. Do not move until the shock wave passes you by." The team nodded and boarded the helicopter. A few minutes later, the wizard and Rashad were left alone in the town. Rashad looked around the city. He seemed nervous. Kuri noticed and asked, "Second thoughts?" Rashad squirmed somewhat. "I must confess, Arif, that although blowing up people with conventional bombs is an honorable way to wage war, this is, well." Kuri finished his statement. "Overkill." Rashad winced, but nodded. "Well, yes, the idea of killing hundreds of thousands of people." Kuri needed to cut this off immediately. "Would you prefer that the West continue their crusade against us, destroying our livelihood and religion? I'm sorry, Rashad, but this is war. Hopefully we won't have to use this weapon against the Americans or anyone else. Let us pray that Allah in his wisdom convinces Clinton to pull out of here. Now, if you would excuse me, I've got to arm the bomb." Hesitantly, Rashad moved away and Kuri approached the bomb. Now that the time had arrived, even he was having second thoughts. However, he pushed them out of his mind. What he was about to do would change the world forever. Had Voldemort even considered the possibility that the Dark Lord would wind up ruling a world of radioactive ruins? Kuri steeled himself, however. He was a wizard and disciplined man. He would do what was necessary to further his and Voldemort's cause. He placed a stasis field around the uranium sphere, which would inhibit all spells for 60 seconds after they were cast. Once all that was done, he pointed his weapon at the little uranium sphere, barely visible on a piece of broken asphalt. Engorgio Maximus, Compressio Maximus. The ball glowed as the stasis field absorbed the spells. Meanwhile, Rashad pressed a button on his wristwatch, and numbers began flickering. Kuri pocketed his wand and grabbed Rashad's arm. "Let's get out of here, now." All of the operatives were heads down in the trench. Rashad screamed, 10 seconds, brace yourselves, 3, 2, 1, 0. Nothing happened for a couple of seconds. Then all hell broke loose as spells attached to the cameras placed on the mountaintops started screaming tones corresponding to code signals into the trench. Sensors on camera 1 incinerated. Sensors on camera 2 incinerated. Camera 1 on fire. Camera 2 incinerated. Camera 3 incinerated. Camera 4 reports bright light in distance. Camera 4 blown off its moorings. Many of the agents screamed in joy when they heard this. Camera 4 was a good 5 kilometers from ground zero. It would take a hell of a big explosion to knock it out. Kuri yelled at everyone to stay down and wait for the sound. His voice was barely audible over the celebrating people. Then the shock wave hit. The sound was deafening, and Kuri worried his eardrums would burst. Rocks flew everywhere, and the tent which had housed the base camp went flying. Waiting a good 10 seconds for everything to subside, Kuri told everyone to stay down as he cast a spell of radiation resistance and protection around himself. He had to see. He stood up and took a peek out of the trench. One of the mountaintops had been sheared off, as if by a giant razor. Towering above the mountains was a roiling mushroom cloud. He made a quick back of the envelope calculation of the device's yield and came up with 25 kilotons, just like what Voldemort had predicted. They did it. They actually did it. Stephen Pitmoss was alone in the empty room. He had been pronounced guilty and sentenced to an odd punishment he had never heard of before. The judge explained that the punishment was the most severe one a wizarding court could hand out, and that it would be carried out at 6:00 a.m. on the 13th. Well, it was 6:00 and the room was still empty. Had they decided to spare his life? He couldn't understand why they would have, but perhaps there had been an irregularity in. Suddenly he felt biting cold. All of his confidence melted away to be replaced with virtually every single negative memory he had ever felt. He screamed in horror. What was this? He couldn't see anything. Something grabbed his head and turned it so it faced upwards. What was this? Was it an invisible monster? There was a terrible sucking sound, and Stephen Pitmoss ceased to exist. Anastasios Dionysus' blood drained from his face as he read the report. "Are you sure about this?" The courier nodded. "Yes, absolutely sure. There's been a nuclear explosion in Afghanistan, the nation which is believed to be the headquarters of Al-Qaeda. We have it at 23 KT in an uninhabited area. I suspect from the location that it is being used as a test firing." Dionysus shook his head in disbelief. "Take us to DEFCON 2. I'll be right there." "Yes, sir." Chapter 210, Human Effects. Thursday, June 13, 1996. 7 days to Judgment Day. Northern Sweden 0342Z Horcruxes left. 1 Cup. Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 2. 5% chance of end of civilization. Lord Voldemort stepped into a Muggle bathroom, wriggled his way out of Chang Sung-Tik's uniform, and used magic to unlock one of the supply closets. The door popped open, and he shoved in the uniform. He then waved his wand and conjured a set of Muggle clothing. Grinning, he changed clothes and left the bathroom dressed like an ordinary Korean man in his 60s. Normally, he wouldn't have left North Korea at a time like this now that things were coming to a head. The United Nations was screaming at him to step down and let a Muggle take over because the sanctions were taking a drastic toll on the population. Voldemort had laughed when he had heard that. The sanctions were worthless, as Voldemort could just Geminio everything. These stupid Muggles had no idea what a powerful wizard like himself could do. Usually, he would have sent Lucius or one of the Indians on this mission. However, this was probably the one thing which he would have to do himself. He had to be the one to master the Elder Wand, not Lucius or anyone else. He made his way over to the house owned by the owner of the Elder Wand. Even though it was 2 in the morning, the sun shone brightly. Even the Dark Lord, who was a great wizard, couldn't get himself to believe that there were times of the year where the sun never set. Making sure no one was around, which wasn't hard because everyone was asleep, he pulled out his wand, disabled the burglar alarm, and unlocked the door. Silent as a mouse, he crept into the house and closed the door behind him. He cast Revelio Hominum to locate his prey, and within 2 minutes he was standing above a sleeping man in his 30s. The man was alone in the bedroom and clad in a red set of pajamas. Next to him, on the coffee table, was the Elder Wand. The man had an odd tattoo on his neck. Voldemort took a closer look and saw that it was a Durmstrang symbol warning people that the man was a condemned criminal who needed to be reported to authorities immediately. Apparently the man had managed to escape death row and was hiding out among the Muggles, who would not recognize the tattoo. Clever bastard, Voldemort thought. However, it wasn't going to help him here. Come to think of it, the people from Durmstrang would probably give him a medal for this. The fact that his opponent wasn't holding the Elder Wand made a messy killing unnecessary. Grinning, Voldemort hit the man with an Avada Kedavra. The green flash subsided, and the man looked exactly the same as he had before, lying there motionless in the bed. Voldemort double-checked that the man was dead and took the Elder Wand. He may have been powerful before, but he was invincible now. Norad Headquarter Shane Mountain 421Z, evening of June 12th local time. Bradley Stepp was awakened from his nap by the insistent beeping of his computer monitor. Cursing himself for falling asleep on duty, he'd probably get reprimanded for this by his manager. He turned to the display to figure out what had happened. He froze when he saw the readout. This had to be a malfunction. It had to be. The computer was reporting a small nuclear detonation in the mountains of Afghanistan. It was estimating the weapon's yield to be around 23 KT. He double-checked the data and was horrified to see that there had been a double-flash signature. There were very few things other than a nuke that could produce a double-flash signature. Stepp frowned for a moment. No one used nukes that small anymore. Although still terribly destructive, the bomb was about the size of the one dropped on Nagasaki. Who would? He answered his own question. Al-Qaeda. They were based in Afghanistan. They had figured out how to make nuclear weapons and had detonated this one in the mountains as a test, or as a warning to any nation who was trying to attack them. Al-Qaeda had already attacked a site in the US once. If they did it again, now that they had a nuke. Stepp reached for the phone. His manager had to hear about this immediately. West Bank 652Z. Eliezer Ben Dor was closing in on the Hamas tank when his communicator began ringing insistently. He swore and activated it. It was just his luck that his commanding officer would call at the moment Eliezer found the tank. The tank was going to get away now that he had only one arm. He couldn't use the communicator and drive his own tank at the same time anymore. He spoke into the communicator. Ben Dor. His manager sounded frantic. Pull back, do you hear me? Pull back, abort. Eliezer grunted in surprise. Abort? Why? I've just about got the guy. It's not just you, Eliezer. We're stopping all actions against Hamas. Eliezer swore. What? Why? Those bastards have been killing our people. I can respond in one sentence, Eliezer. Al-Qaeda just detonated a nuke, and one of their demands is that we stop harassing Hamas. Eliezer couldn't believe it. We don't give in to terrorism. Has Netanyahu gone mad? Besides, are you certain it's a nuke? We're certain. We've got confirmation from various sources, including NORAD. It's in the mountains of Afghanistan and is about the size of the Nagasaki bomb. The area is uninhabited, and it appears to be a test firing. Tell me about it, Eliezer. At any rate, don't be so sure we'll give up. We're just buying time until we can figure out what to do. Now call off the pursuit and get out of there. Eliezer nodded. Yes, Sir Ben Dor out. He deactivated the communicator and turned the tank around. He didn't like where this was heading. He didn't like it at all. White House 704Z. The secure phone rang in the White House bedroom, jarring Clinton out of his sleep. Hoping that the sleeping woman lying next to him wouldn't wake up, he grabbed the headset before it could ring again. He had a scary thought that it was Hillary. If Hillary caught him like this, well, that would be a problem. Then he noticed the color of the phone. It was the red one, the one that connected to NORAD. His face grew ashen. Emergency calls from NORAD were probably the one thing more troubling than a call from his wife in these circumstances. He spoke into the phone. General, what's going on? The head of NORAD spoke into the phone. Mr. President, I apologize for waking you, but there's been an incident. We've detected a nuclear explosion in the mountains of Afghanistan. Estimated yield is 23 KT. We suspect that it's an Al-Qaeda bomb. Clinton was speechless for a good 10 seconds. Son of a bitch, Al-Qaeda actually had bombs, and they were willing to use them. It appeared that Radner had underestimated how ruthless those Saabs could be. He suspected that Radner's 1 in 5 had just become 3 in 5 or worse. The general spoke urgently. Mr. President, do you copy? Clinton finally found his voice. Yes, General, I copy. How confident are you that this is not a false alarm? We've got a double flash signature, so confidence is very high. Clinton thought back to the movie War Games. Has there been any unusual internet activity in and around NORAD? We've checked for that, so nothing. This isn't War Games or a cyber attack. Furthermore, we're getting reports from the USCs as well. They've picked up an earthquake in that area consistent with a 23 KT surface blast. Where's Ground Zero? Ground Zero is the site of an abandoned mining town whose translates to English as Seven Hills. The remains of the town have been completely destroyed. We suspect that they did the test there to see how buildings responded to the blast. Clinton's mind reeled as he tried to figure out what to do. He tried to recall Al-Qaeda's demands. Now that they had actually demonstrated the willingness to use nukes, he might have to consider them. Suddenly, something occurred to him. Al-Qaeda had demanded that he withdraw from Afghanistan. Ordinary troops wouldn't be much good against wizards, and Al-Qaeda was known to have wizards. He could just recall the Muggle troops and replace them with a hotshot team of wizards and Delta Force people like the group that was being assembled to go to North Korea. It would be like the operation against Dilmi, but much, much larger, and much more devastating. Hopefully, the feigned retreat would buy time for people to think of a better option. There were two problems, however. First, he wasn't sure that he could afford to divert many wizards to Afghanistan while everyone was getting ready to deploy to North Korea. Second, the Al-Qaeda nuclear threat was classified, as would be the Delta Force mission to take out the terrorist organization in the aftermath of the Seven Hills nuclear test. This meant that the only thing the Americans would hear about would be a retreat from Afghanistan with nothing to replace it. They probably wouldn't like it. Was he willing to sacrifice the November election for the sake of safety and security of the American people? He hoped he would not have to make this decision. Chapter 211, Kerbin. Friday, June 14, 1996, 6 days to Judgment Day 1900's Western Wall Jerusalem Horcruxes left. 1. Cup. Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 2, dressed in the garb of a religious Jew and polyjuiced by the wizard, the sheik joined the throng of people heading for the Western Wall. They searched him. He had nothing on him other than a camera and let him proceed to the foot of the wall. They warned him, however, that he should try to avoid taking photographs out of respect for the worshippers' Sabbath beliefs. Judging from the rest of the tourists' responses, there were still a few people taking pictures. This probably meant he could get away with it, and even if he was escorted out, his mission would have been completed anyway. His mission was to photograph a location to deliver the Portkey missile to. The wizard could not create a Portkey without first envisioning the target in his mind. Since the wizard had never been to the wall before, he wouldn't know where to aim. And even if he had a picture, someone had to scout the area out and tell everyone where the Jewish pilgrims were. He followed the rest of the men towards the wall, letting the crowd take him towards the largest concentration of people. Shortly before reaching the wall, he pulled back and took out his camera. He snapped a quick picture with top-of-the-line digital camera, feigned surprise, apologized to the pilgrims, and left the plaza. Once out of sight of the wall, he grabbed an old newspaper he had placed in his robe. The newspaper was a portkey which sent him back to the operations headquarters 10 miles or so away in the mountains. From this vantage point, the Hamas operatives had a clear view of the city of Jerusalem. He brought out the camera and showed the photograph to the wizard. There's your target. Throw the missile in there and it will probably knock out the wall, kill off a bunch of the pilgrims, and hopefully drop a few of those big stones on the rest of their heads. The wizard nodded and gestured to the man next to him. The man walked over to the disillusioned missile and armed its rocket engine. The charm wouldn't prevent people from seeing the missile's exhaust, but at that point it would be too late for the Zionists to stop it. The wizard then stepped to the weapon, tapped it with his wand, and said, "Portus." The missile glowed for a few moments. Everything was all set. Telling everyone to run for cover, he had one of the Muggles arm the weapon. Asking Allah for luck on this mission, he launched the weapon at the target. The missile disappeared. Seconds later, it reappeared in midair a few hundred feet away from the wall. The rocket engine fired, and the missile flew into the base of the wall. There was a tremendous explosion. Blocks of stone flew everywhere, and the sheik could have sworn he could hear the screams from here. The missile was likely to take out a good third of the wall and maybe a good 50 or so pilgrims. The operatives congratulated themselves and drove away just as helicopters and fire engines started racing towards the scene. Al-Qaeda's nuke was going to make things easier for them. Hamas could attack Israel, but Israel couldn't attack Hamas. The sheik wondered at what point they should finish the job, nuke Tel Aviv, and warn Israel that they would keep on nuking cities until the state of Israel agreed to dissolve itself and surrender all its land to the Palestinians 42Z on the 15th Pyongyang. Arif Kuri chuckled. Rashad, that's brilliant. You're thinking of leaking the information about the nuclear test onto the internet so that we can scare the Israelis and Americans. That will work well with sending the tapes to CNN, Reuters, the BBC, and other locations outside the US. Rashid nodded. That's right, Arif. Judging from the ordinary Americans' and Israelis' reaction to the initial nuclear bluff, I get the impression that the governments classified the information. Terrorism won't work all that well if the ordinary citizens don't get terrified. Well, I doubt that Clinton and Netanyahu can block all internet access, let alone newspapers. Curry frowned. Might they be able to use wizards to do so? Rashid shook his head. I doubt it. Remember what happened after the Super Bowl. The information spread too quickly for your people to contain it. Besides, what have we got to lose? We might as well try it. Curry nodded. Can't hurt. Do you know someone familiar enough with computers to do such a thing and who has access to the internet? Rashid nodded. Layali Nahas does. She's got a degree in computer science from Caltech. It's a pity we lost Siddiqui, she'd have worked as well. However, Allah works in mysterious ways. Good. Let's throw the fear of Allah into our enemy. Chapter 212. The Riots Begin. Saturday, June 15, 1996, 5 days to Judgment Day 0631 Zoval Office White House, Washington, DQ United States of America Horcruxes left. 1. Cup, Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 2 Bill Clinton was tired. He felt like he hadn't slept for a week. Yet here he was, still at his office at 2:30 in the morning. His body told him that he needed to sleep, yet his duty to his country came first. The familiar blonde woman usually at his side pleaded with him to go to sleep. His wife did, too. It wasn't often that the two women actually agreed on something. He promised both of them that he'd take at least a 4-hour nap at the end of this day. The situation did not look good. Hamas had just portkeyed another missile into Jerusalem, knocking out the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, and killing 35 pilgrims. Suleiman I, still in the hospital, had issued a fatwa pronouncing a death sentence on the leader of Hamas, the enigmatic man known as the Sheikh, but it didn't do much good. Even worse, much to the horror of American Jews, Israel had only put up a token response. It seemed as if they had given up in the fight against Hamas, even though they had the superior military. Clinton knew why, of course. Al-Qaeda had indicated that both Israel and the United States could suffer nuclear strikes if the West didn't give in to Curry's demands. Judging from what he had heard from Benjamin Netanyahu, the new prime minister, the Israeli government had cut back on the pursuit of Hamas so that it could buy time to figure out what to do next. Netanyahu had classified the Al-Qaeda nuclear test, however, so none of the civilians in America or Israel could tell why the Israelis had suddenly backed off. Clinton wasn't faring much better in the United States, either. His announcement that he would stop the flow of troops and materiel into Afghanistan had caused an uproar in the electorate. His approval rating had dropped by 11 points, and Bob Dole, his Republican opponent in the November election, was calling him Bill Chicken. At the rate things were going, he would probably be out of a job come January. He had to do something. But what? If he told the people the truth, the citizens would panic and flee the cities in droves, even though there was no indication that Al-Qaeda had chosen a target, let alone one in the United States. There was a knock on the door. Rubbing his eyes, he told the secretary to admit the newcomer. The door opened, and Radner entered the room with the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense didn't mince words. Mr. President, we've got even a bigger problem than we realize. We have uncovered intelligence which ties Al-Qaeda and Hamas to locations in North Korea. There is a distinct possibility that all our troops are going after a feint. Clinton swore. How the hell are they able to coordinate attacks in the Middle East while operating out of North Korea? The Secretary of Magic drew a deep breath. You're not going to like this, sir. However, the intelligence seems to be conclusive. Both terror organizations are working for Voldemort. It is increasingly obvious that the British wizard is trying to take over the world, and he's using the threat of nuclear terrorism to force people to listen to him. Radner bored in. Everything is starting to fall into place now. The security cameras covering the area around the western wall got a good shot of the debris left by the missile. It had North Korean markings on it. Voldemort is supplying Al-Qaeda and Hamas with both wizards and weapons. And as we are now unfortunately aware, nukes created by magic and fueled by uranium taken from an experimental nuclear reactor outside of Pyongyang. Shit, we need to get rid of that madman post-haste. The Secretary of Defense nodded. I agree, Mr. President. However, I get the distinct impression that any attack on North Korea will be immediately met with a nuclear response by either Voldemort or one of the terrorist organizations. Clinton tried to think. We need to prevent that weapon from getting into the country. What's the best way to do that? No, scratch that. If you were a wizard, how would you do it? Radner. Radner grimaced. Apparition into foreign countries is prohibited. However, there is a loophole which allows for portkeys. International portkeys are permitted. I'd send the weapon in through a portkey. I would also consider fideliusing the device and sneaking it over the border or into a port. A port would be an ideal location, because the terrorist could detonate it if he was captured. Clinton grunted. Fidelius is the spell which makes it so you can't see it unless you interrogate the secret keeper. That's right, Mr. President. To be perfectly frank, sir, I'm not sure we'll be able to block it if it's a Fidelius. You're going to have the same problem we have trying to find the Al-Qaeda base, but in this case, the object can be transported from place to place. For all we know, someone can discover the weapon in a cargo container in San Diego, have the wizard portkey it to just outside Denver, and blow up Denver with it before anyone realized it. Clinton couldn't believe this. You're a wizard, Radner. Surely you can be able to stop this. Radner shook his head. Without access to the secret keeper, or at the very least someone who figured out where the object was before the Fidelius was applied, and before it was moved, even a wizard can't do it. The spell was developed to protect top-level state secrets, sir. It was never intended to make stealth bombs. Portkeys were supposed to be means of transportation, not methods of delivering weapons. Geminio was designed for duplicating food and resources, not giving Al-Qaeda unlimited numbers of nukes. And Engorgio/Compressio, well, we don't want to even go there. Clinton put his head in his hands. Radner, what's your recommendation? Radner closed his eyes in resignation. All I can do is put a portkey wall around the country which will prevent portkeys from entering. They'll bounce off the wall and rematerialize so customs agents can get at them. I'd also recommend stationing wizards from the various regional offices around the border to make sure nothing gets in by sea, through Mexico, or through Canada. Although there isn't much we can do about a Fidelius nuke, we can take care of the rest and hope they don't Fidelius a nuke. Clinton nodded. Make it so. In the meantime, I want you, Mr. Secretary of Defense, to take everyone we've just shipped out of Afghanistan and send them over to North Korea. We've been planning an operation to get Voldemort out of there for a while now. I want him dead by the end of next week. Period. If you need magical help, talk to Radner. That's an order. No one here is going to draw his salary until I see his head on this desk. Radner winced. We can't take him out immediately, unfortunately. We're still waiting on the operation to get rid of the Horcrux in the bank in London. Slytherin Common Room Hogwarts School of Witchcraft of Wizardry Great Britain 956Z. Draco Malfoy never thought he'd be staying at Hogwarts over the summer. However, he didn't really have a choice. His entire family was dead with the exception of Lucius, who had taken up residence in North Korea. Draco had asked Dumbledore, who still stupidly believed that he had defected. The man trusted students too much to stay with him, and the former headmaster had agreed to do so once Voldemort was defeated, and Lucius agreed to return to the light side. Until then, he would have to stay at Hogwarts under Dumbledore's protection. Considering that none of the Death Eaters Draco had known growing up in England were still alive, the man had a point. Crabbe and Goyle were on missions for the Dark Lord. The three friends' clandestine meetings, they couldn't meet in the open without blowing Draco's cover, were still going on. Crabbe was doing pretty well at his job, serving as a bodyguard for an Indian Death Eater. Goyle was still having a bit of trouble with his. At least they were still alive. In times like this, they were the only friends in the area he could trust. The door to the common room opened, and Draco looked up from his book. Dumbledore entered and sat down next to him. "Good morning, Draco. I hope I'm not bothering you." Draco shook his head. "You aren't, Professor. What do you want?" Dumbledore looked at him. "Draco, I need you to do us a favor. You see, we believe we've identified the location of Voldemort's final Horcrux. It's in a vault in Gringotts, which used to belong to Bellatrix Lestrange. We've been told that you have the key to this vault. Would you be willing to give it to us?" Draco reached under his robes and retrieved the key. "You're in luck, Professor. I have it on me. You're also lucky Voldemort was stupid enough to try to get me to kill Snape. Otherwise, you'd be in big trouble." Draco handed over the key, and Dumbledore pocketed it. "Thank you very much, Draco. You have done a great service today, and I promise that I will protect you if Voldemort ever finds out you've betrayed him." Draco faked fear. "I sure hope you can, Professor. He's very powerful." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled. "He is, Draco. However, I've got a few spells up my sleeve which even he doesn't have the ability to counter. Trust me, Draco. You're safe with me." And with that, Dumbledore turned on his heel and left the room. Once the door was closed, Draco burst out laughing. He couldn't wait to see the expression on Dumbledore's face when they found that the Horcrux wasn't in the vault anymore. That was, if he could even get into the vault, considering that the force field on the door wouldn't let anyone pass other than Draco himself or his father Atlantis, 1031Z. Dialanis addressed the 10 wizards standing in front of him. "All right, people. We're at DEFCON 2, so I'm permitted to send you out of here to get you into position to attack Voldemort and his minions should we reach DEFCON 1. Remember the spell I've taught you, one which can only be activated by that ring on your finger, the one with the serpent biting its tail. Once the spell is activated, a shield will appear around you, which will allow nothing, absolutely nothing, to penetrate. Magic won't hurt you short of a direct hit by the Elder Wand in the hands of its master, and mundane technology won't harm you short of a nuclear weapon." He shot them a warning glance. "One caveat. The shield prevents all gases from passing through. This includes air, so be certain to cast the spell to turn carbon dioxide into oxygen from time to time so you don't asphyxiate. Do you have any questions?" The wizards were silent. Dialanis nodded and said, "All right, you are authorized to take off. Remember, do not actually interfere with anything unless we hit DEFCON 1. Tang Hall, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1225Z. Michelle Patterson heard a scream from upstairs. Terrified, the grad student raced up to see what had happened to her boyfriend. Louis was panting nervously, almost as if he'd run up all 11 flights. He looked as if he had seen a ghost or dragon. Michelle stared at him. "Lou, what happened?" In response, her husband just pointed at the computer screen. "Read it." Suspicious, Michelle looked at the monitor. It appeared to show a page in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. It showed a picture of an Indian man and a reference to Al-Qaeda. Underneath the picture of the Indian man appeared to be scenes from a nuclear test. Judging from the size of the explosion, the bomb appeared to have been about the size of the weapons used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was Al-Qaeda trying to frighten everyone with pictures of footage from the war? Then she realized that the detonation had taken place in a mountainous region, and there were no signs of civilization in the area. Finally, they were in color. There were very few photographs of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki tests in color. This had to be a more recent test, then. Increasingly disturbed, she read the caption underneath the pictures. Images of Seven Hills nuclear test. 25 KT device detonated by our glorious army in Afghanistan, 13 June. She froze. Al-Qaeda had nukes. No, please, no. Terrified, she began reading the article underneath the test footage. Seconds later, she was screaming, and the people next door were coming over and checking to see what was going on. She told them. Within 3 minutes, all of them were screaming as Well Oval Office, 1532Z. The Secretary of Defense barged into the Oval Office, absolute horror on his face. Clinton could only think of one thing. Shit, who was hit? The Secretary shook his head. No one was hit, Mr. President. To be honest, sir, a definite nuclear strike may have better than what just happened. Clinton stared at him. What? I hate to think. In response, the cabinet member wheeled a computer into the room and brought up a page on the internet. Clinton took one look at it and swore. Shit, Al-Qaeda leaked the information onto the internet. They've completely gotten around our secrecy protocols and spoken directly to the people. We've got to lock down that website as soon as possible. The secretary's eyes were wide. I'm afraid it's too late, sir. The word has already leaked out and is spreading like wildfire all throughout the country. You mean? I'm afraid so, Mr. President. Riots, fires, looting, and uncontrolled chaos have broken out in no fewer than 19 cities, including here in Washington. The mass exodus into the countryside has begun. Clinton couldn't believe it. Summoning the Secret Service and a helicopter crew, he headed into a helicopter stationed on the White House grounds to take a bird's-eye view of the capital of the United States. From his vantage point 1,000 feet above the White House, he could see at least 8 fires blazing. The highways leading out of town were completely gridlocked, and there were cops trying to control a mob on the National Mall. Rubeus Hagrid, the half-giant running the magical creatures exhibit at the zoo, had apparently hidden a wand in his umbrella and was being pressed into duty as a member of the brute squad. The police were being overwhelmed by all the looters, and Clinton watched someone break into a store in real time. Taking out a portable radio, he turned to one of the FM stations. A familiar REM song was being broadcast. It's the end of the world as we know it. Unlike the lead singer of REM, Clinton didn't feel fine. He hated to think what happens if the CIA found conclusive evidence as to which cities would be attacked. Chapter 213. Dragons at the DMZ. Saturday, June 15, 1996, 5 days to Judgment Day, 1200 Z Presidential Palace, Pyongyang Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Horcruxes left. 1. Cup, Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 2. Voldemort, once again safely in his disguise as Chang Sungtik, looked into the camera and began to speak. Good evening. As you know, I have made several changes since I've took office after Kim Jong-il's unfortunate death. Whereas our previous leader was unable to combine both communist values and fair treatment of our nation's citizens, I have succeeded due to my magical abilities. This message is being broadcast all around the world, for I deem it important enough that everyone hear what I am about to say. It is well known that a communist lifestyle works on a small scale. Just look at the Israeli kibbutzim. In principle, that can be scaled up to managing something the size of a nation. However, in practice, that has proven difficult. I have found, however, that the fact that I am a wizard helps immensely with this task, as I am able to use magic to provide resources which Kim Jong-il would have been forced to work our citizens to death to achieve. This has allowed me to cut back on the quotas for the North Korean people, giving them 2 luxuries that they never would have been to obtain under the previous regime: a better standard of living and more free time. My staff has spent some time exploring the country incognito and have reported that I am still extremely popular and seen, in some places, as a savior. Nations of the world consider the following. My government has shown that communism and contentment can coexist through the nation. With this in mind, look at your own nations. There is a great inequality between the classes, where the rich subjugate the poor and the powerful intimidate the downtrodden. In a classless society such as ours, the inequalities are smoothed out and everyone is on the same level. I can understand your not having adopted communism given what happened to North Korea under my predecessors. The lives of the lower classes were short and brutal, and many people in the West were grateful they didn't live in North Korea. However, now that the statute of secrecy has fallen and that national leaders are allowed to use magic openly, it may be time to give communism a second chance. As a result, I believe it is my duty to offer the following service to the world. North Korea, like all communist states, is still working steadfastly to rid the world of capitalist domination. From this country's experience so far, militarism has not worked. Well, I propose that I try a different tactic. Instead of using the stick, we will use the carrot. With your permission, I will allow some of my wizards to work with your governments into implementing reforms which will help transition your societies like this one, where the people are content and class distinctions have been abolished forever. Needless to say, an abrupt change to communist methodologies will be difficult, and even for a wizard, unfeasible. What I will instruct these wizards to do will be to discuss the matter with your governing councils and have each country embark on a program which will combine communism, happiness, and prosperity. We in North Korea acknowledge that some of you may not choose to follow our advice. However, we hope that you will at least allow one of the North Korean wizards to serve as an advisor to your cabinets and parliaments. Voldemort didn't tell anyone that these advisors would do the same thing Rickpreet had done to King Fard, cast the imperious curse on the nation's commander-in-chief and turn the country over to Voldemort. Then again, they didn't really need to know that, did they? He continued. You may argue, why should I bother having North Korea's wizards in our governments when we have wizards of our own? There are several reasons. First, we in North Korea have more experience with melding communism and magic. Second, your wizards are likely extremely busy at the moment dealing with problems related to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. I must confess, the idea of nuclear terrorism scares me, and I've got a bunch of people here dealing with Al-Qaeda issues. That wasn't a lie, of course. However, it was a case where the audience wouldn't realize that he wasn't saying what everyone thought he was saying, as the sentence was carefully ambiguous. Finally, I give you my solemn word that countries who accept this olive branch will no longer be seen as enemies of the North Korean state, even if they are capitalist. Although I don't expect that you will go communist immediately. If at all, the fact remains that accepting my proposal proves that you are committed to peace. I vow to you this day that nations which accept this proposal will never be attacked by North Korea militarily, economically, or in any other way. We are only here to help, after all. Nations which reject this proposal will retain their current designation as enemy nations and will have to deal with the consequences. Considering that Al-Qaeda is making life difficult for all of us and is stretching all of our resources, I urge you all to consider my request. One additional comment directed at my colleagues in the South. As you have seen over the past few weeks, we've brought a lot of troops to the border for our protection. You have to understand that we have to take precautions considering that your men sent wizards to kill Kim Jong-il. If that isn't a hostile act, I don't know what is. My friends in Seoul, I encourage you to accept this offer. Otherwise, it's almost certain that these two countries will renew hostilities at some point, and that is a result neither of us want. One final thing. I am becoming increasingly distressed by all of the embargoes being placed against me and my people. I haven't done anything to most of you, yet you punish my people because of completely fabricated claims that my intentions are not genuine. If I were you, I would rethink those sanctions. South side of the DMZ 1308Z, the South Korean lieutenant stared through his binoculars at the strange sight on the other side. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This had to be a practical joke or a hallucination, he thought. He needed a second opinion, so he handed the binoculars to the man next to him. The second soldier grunted at him. "You want me to do what?" The lieutenant pointed across the DMZ at the object in the distance. "Take a look at that big red thing over there and tell me if it is what I think it is." Skeptical, the man put the binoculars to his eyes. He frowned. "It looks like a big tent of some weight. Did it just move?" "Zoom out a little so you get the big picture. You're probably focusing on only a piece of it." The second soldier adjusted the controls and took another look at the object. For the first time, he could see the thing in its entirety. What he had thought was a tent was actually a wing. It was a flying object about the size of an aircraft. However, it wasn't an aircraft. The two soldiers looked at each other. The second soldier frowned, rubbed his eyes, and looked at the object again. Slowly, he lowered his binoculars, put his head in his hands, and returned the binoculars to the lieutenant. The lieutenant prompted him. "Well, is it what I think it is? Am I imagining something?" The second soldier slowly shook his head. "If you're imagining something, I must be imagining it as well. This can't be happening. This is not fair." "So you think it's what I think it is as well, right?" The second soldier nodded. "It's a dragon, all right. God help us all." West Bank 1700 Z. Accompanied by Portkey missiles and conventional bombs, the Hamas vehicles appeared out of nowhere and began plowing through the West Bank with reckless abandon. Careful not to bunch up and make a tempting target for the Israelis, they started firing on settlements and began reoccupying the land which had been disputed since 1967. The sheik smiled. Israel put up a bit of a fight, but the Zionists couldn't do much with al-Qaeda's nuclear ultimatum breathing down their neck. Al-Qaeda had warned Israel that any nuclear activity or attack on Hamas would put Tel Aviv, Haifa, or some other major Israeli city at risk for a Seven Hills-style nuclear blast. Al-Qaeda and Hamas working in tandem. This was going to be fun, he thought. It was a shame that Rodolphus Lestrange wasn't around to see this. What the sheik couldn't know was that the Israelis were just stalling for time. Chapter 214, Nordamark. Saturday, June 15, 1996, 5 days to Judgment Day 2154 ZM/S Nordam Fort Lauderdale, Floridonid States of America Horcruxes left. 1. Cup. Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 2 Michael DeVries looked in disbelief at the chaos in the terminal from his sanctuary on the bridge of the Nordam. As a child, he had always envisioned himself playing the role of Noah and sailing a huge ship across the oceans. However, this was getting ridiculous. The ship had recently returned from its eventful month-long trip to the Caribbean. Although by far the most serious event on the trip had been the werewolf attack, the world had gotten more and more dangerous as the ship made its way back to the United States. Harrison Cooper had tried to tell everyone that he had no idea that he was going to turn into a werewolf, and that he would have never hurt any of those people had he been given the choice. Most of the people had been skeptical at first, but they had slowly come around when Jarrett Huozing, Rufus Scrimgeour, and a veritable who's who of wizarding figures explained what had happened, and that Harrison should no longer be considered a threat. Within a couple of days, things had returned to normal. One person, a man who had been injured in the attack, but thankfully not bitten, only Claude, had supposedly been planning to sue Harrison for damages. Considering that Harrison's psyche had been completely subsumed by that of the werewolf during the transformation, the British man argued he was innocent. DeVries didn't want to be the judge who would have to rule on that. Things had started getting more serious, however, as they had approached the mainland. For one thing, absolute bedlam had erupted in the Middle East. The Cohen Gadol had nearly been assassinated. The Pope, John Paul Roman II had been threatened. The famous Western Wall was in ruins, and Hamas was making a real mess of things. To make matters worse, 2 days earlier, al-Qaeda had detonated a nuke in the mountains of Afghanistan. They had promised the Americans and Israelis that a city in the West would be targeted if a long list of demands were not met, such as America pulling out of Afghanistan and Israel for all practical purposes, surrendering to Hamas. There had been no immediate reaction to the Seven Hills nuclear test, as the information had been classified. Everything had changed, however, earlier this afternoon when Al-Qaeda, in a devilishly clever scheme, leaked information about the test to the internet. Within the hour, riots had erupted all over the United States as terrified civilians took to the highways to get away from the cities. Virtually all of the big cities were evacuating, or at least trying to, as the highways leading out of town were absolutely gridlocked. The airports were crammed with passengers who were willing to pay $2,500 per seat or more to get out of town. In some cases, however, there were other means people had to evacuate, such as cruise ships. About 80% of the supplies for the Nordums' next cruise had been loaded on board when a man had hurried out of the cruise terminal carrying a little backpack and waving at the ship. The Fort Lauderdale employees gently intercepted him and began to escort him away from the ship. That was when doors to the cruise terminal crashed open and hundreds of people started racing towards the ship, many of whom were carrying little more than the clothes on their back. The cruiser port personnel and the ship's security officers were overpowered within a matter of minutes. All of the guards had been trained well, but numbers made a difference. Within 15 minutes, at least 2,000 people had raced on board. And judging from what he was seeing out the window, the flood was only beginning. Cameras placed throughout the ship showed people everywhere, although most of them were concentrating on breaking into staterooms and claiming them as quickly as possible. The refugees were running all over the place. Half of them were setting up linen on beach chairs on the top deck, near where the werewolf had ravaged the cocktail lounge. He grimaced as one of the men managed to open one of the artfully concealed doors that headed into the employees' quarters in the center of the ship and below a deck. The flood charged into the employees' section and soon found themselves fighting with the Holland America personnel for rights to cots and beds. For the first time he could recall, the ship was swamped with animals. Dogs and cats were running everywhere, 2 guinea pigs had broken loose, and at least one snake had escaped its cage. At the rate things were going, he wouldn't be surprised to see pairs of giraffes, rhinos, and hippos trying to make their way up the gangway. He looked at Bernhard, his first officer. The 2 men had originally decided to pack up and leave before the crowd got too big. However, it finally dawned on them that the mob wasn't seeing the Nordum as a cruise ship. They were seeing it as an ark. It was a difficult decision, but they decided that they would wait until 5,000 people had boarded before they cast off. They would probably have to ration food and water like mad, and people would probably get very hungry. But luxury wasn't the issue here. Survival was. These people saw the ship as their only means of escape, and who could blame them? Waiting until the ship reached that limit was the right thing to do. Where would DeVries go? Probably out into the Atlantic somewhere. He was debating dropping everyone on Half Moon Key, but nixed that pretty quickly, as there was no way the island would be able to support that many people. All he could do was watch out the window and wait slither in common room 2211Z. Draco Malfoy looked over the letter one last time. Seeing that what he had written was to his satisfaction, he attached it to the owl's leg and sent it on its way. I am writing to inform you that the Order of the Phoenix is planning to raid Gringotts in an attempt to go after the Hufflepuff Cup. This raid will take place Monday morning, British time. I have given them the key to the vault, of course, as they think I am on their side. Although the cup is no longer there, and the tiara are in the lake near Hogwarts. As you know, I recommend that you send a large force of Death Eaters over there to prevent the Order from making it into Gringotts. This will enhance their belief there on the trail of your Horcrux, even though they aren't anywhere near it. I hope you are doing well, and I wish you luck on North Korea's attempt to detonate an Engorgio/Compressio bomb underground. Hopefully, this test will convince the nations of the world to accept Death Eaters into their service, so we can imperious their leaders and hand you control of their countries. Send my love to my father. Sincerely. Draco Malfoydeth, Eater Headmistress's Office, Hogwarts 2300Z. The headmistress's office was absolutely jammed with people. The Hogwarts staff was there. Rufus Scrimgeour was there. Sirius Black was there. At least 10 people in British military uniforms were there, including representatives from the RAF, the Marines, and Me-6. Secret Service agents were there. It was a veritable who's who of the most powerful wizards and warriors in Britain. The paintings of the headmasters on the walls were surprised at seeing Muggles in this holy of holies. Several of them complained. However, they soon fell silent once they realized what they were talking about. Professor Dumbledore waved his wand, and a ghostly three-dimensional map of Diagon Alley materialized in midair. Walking through the illusion, he began indicating various features. This, gentlemen, is the leaky cauldron. That's how the Muggles will have to enter the alley. We'll likely have to demolish the building to get the armored personnel carriers through there, or at the very minimum move it. This store over here is Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes, the newly opened joke shop. This here is Ollivander's Everybody Grab as many wands as they can and arm as many Diagon Alley denizens as possible. Remember, Muggles cannot touch wands, as they will receive electric shocks if they do so. It is almost certain that Voldemort is going to find out that we're after the Horcrux. There is no obvious reason for Muggles to try to break into Gringotts otherwise. As a result, we should assume that there is going to be a substantial effort to prevent us from getting into Gringotts. They will be shooting to kill. If you have to, do so as well. Normally, the unforgivable curses are forbidden, but in an emergency operation like this, the minister has given us permission to use them. Once we're dropped off, the people in the tank should do whatever they can to create a diversion to distract the Death Eaters outside the bank and prevent them from getting inside. If everything goes as planned, Draco here will lead us to the vault, point out the Horcrux, and destroy it. McGonagall slowly shook her head. Albus, Draco is a minor. He shouldn't be using magic outside of school. You of all people should know that, considering that you had to go out of your way to prevent Harry from being kicked out of school. And Draco's certainly not trained to duel a Death Eater. Scrimgeour spoke in Dumbledore's defense. I'm not particularly thrilled about it myself, Minerva. However, he's familiar with the Death Eaters and many of their tactics. He has to come along. Can't we use Igor or someone like that in this role? I'm not sure, Headmistress. If I were Voldemort, I would have someone alert Gringotts that there is a theft in progress. That may prevent anyone not owning a vault to enter it. This may prevent Igor from grabbing the cup even if he has the key. If that's the case, we're going to need Draco. The planning committee pressed on, deep into the night. Chapter 215, North Korean Nuke. Sunday, June 16, 1996. 4 days to Judgment Day 0003, Zlergib, Citalaputa Elslandlaputa Gulliver, Consortium Horcruxes left. 1. Cup Atlantis, alert status. DEFCON 2 High Priest Utler Roman III and his bodyguards completed their tour around the capital city's waterfront. Lone Pelt had done something, that was obvious. There was a faint hint of magical energy surrounding the island like a wall. As far as he could tell, the wall was unbroken and was in a perfect position to keep out the water. And keep out the water it did, as far as he could tell. The tide had risen a few feet since Lone had installed the wall, and the change in water level was obvious, so obvious that even a Muggle could have probably noticed it. The barrier itself was invisible. However, the sheer, 3-foot-high vertical wall of water on the other side of the barrier was too mind-blowing to believe. He could see fish swimming freely until they crashed into the barrier. For the most part, they either jerked back in shock or were stunned long enough for another fish to eat them up. He was about to congratulate Lone when the inventor himself suddenly winced. Oops. That was a word Utler really didn't want to hear. Drawing a deep breath, he asked slowly, "What do you mean, oops?" Lone pointed out at the wall. The wall works, as you can see, and it goes around the entire island. It will protect the harbor up to a depth of 30 feet, which will be more than enough to prevent Lerbig City from flooding again. Utler nodded. I see. What's the problem then? Your Excellency, how does one of us take a sailboat out to go fishing? Although the sailboat will pass through the wall, it won't work well if it crashes into a vertical wall of water. At the very minimum, the boat will flood if the water level outside the barrier is higher, or the boat will fall into the surf and damage itself if the water level outside is lower than the level inside. Utler shrugged. We just take the wall down and oh right, that 3-foot wall of water will fall on top of us. I see your point. What do we do about it? Your Excellency, I recommend that we wait until the water level equalizes again, remove the barrier, and then reconstruct the wall on the beach above the high tide marker. That will allow us to get boats out and prevent the floods. I must say, however, this mistake has a silver lining. It shows that the magic is in fact strong enough to protect the entire island. Utler nodded. I agree. Next time we have a flood and everyone realizes how useful your invention is, we'll get you raised to the priesthood and try selling this service to the rest of the Gulliver consortium. I suspect that the Lilliputians would give a great deal for something like this. What's 3 feet for us is probably half a mile to them. 0059, Zweapons testing ground B Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Lucius Malfoy amplified his voice for the benefit of the dignitaries in the room. 1 minute to go, gentlemen. Let me remind you that because this detonation is underground, you will not see anything dramatic like a mushroom cloud, shock wave, or fireball. However, you will almost certainly feel a small earthquake if the test is successful. The yield of this device should be about 25 kT, similar to that detonated by Al-Qaeda, and about the size of the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Voldemort and the rest of the people in the room nodded and looked at the clock. Slowly but surely, the second hand crept up to hit the 12. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then, suddenly, the earth shook. Some of the plaster fell from the ceiling, but that was about it. A few minutes passed, while the Army's engineers estimated the explosive yield of the device, given the intensity of the earthquake and the known distance to ground zero. They concluded that the weapon had released 26 plus 5 kT worth of energy. There were handshakes all around. North Korea was now a nuclear power, and thanks to the Geminio spell, the state had an unlimited number of small nukes like this. Voldemort was fairly certain that people would start listening to him now. People immediately started pressing him to use the devices on the south. Voldemort was doubtful that he'd actually use the weapons unless there was no alternative, but it was only polite for him to listen to the soldiers. Besides, unless he was badly mistaken, dragons and basilisks would scare the south much more than nukes would. 0116 Z Presidential Palace, Pyongyang. There were a couple of notes on his desk by the time he had returned to his office. One of them was a message from the Chinese government indicating that they would be willing to take him up on his offer. He wasn't surprised. They were communist and having trouble keeping everyone in line. The idea of Death Eaters controlling China with 1 billion people made him lick his thin lips in anticipation. He was still smiling as he opened the second letter. It appeared to be from Draco Malfoy. The letter was relatively short, only 1 page. Voldemort read through the letter, and his face went red with rage. Bringing out the Elder Wand, he blasted the document to smithereens. He then pressed the dark mark on his arm, summoning all of the Death Eaters in North Korea to him. He had managed to recruit some of the Koreans by this point, so within a few minutes no fewer than 13 men and women, 6 Indians, 6 Koreans, and Lucius were standing in his presence. Voldemort started pacing around the room angrily. Ladies and gentlemen, we appear to have a problem. It appears that Albus Dumbledore has done something particularly rash. 0205 Zoval Office. The phone rang insistently in the Oval Office as the stars were coming out after another long night. Throwing back another shot of coffee, Bill Clinton picked up the phone. "Mr. President, this is the head of NORAD. The USCS has picked up an earthquake signature in North Korea, which seems to match that of an underground nuclear test." Clinton closed his eyes. This was not fair. Aloud, he asked, "How big?" "About 26 kT. The same size, more or less, as the Seven Hills blast. Assuming that Al-Qaeda hasn't suddenly decided turn on Voldemort from our mouth to God's ears. It seems that they've told Voldemort how to create backpack nukes, or possibly the other way around. North Korea is, as of this moment, a nuclear power." Clinton was speechless. This was not right. This was so not right. 1011 Zalaxa Mosque. Gunfire blazed, and the Hamas soldiers raced into the mosque and began cutting down everyone in sight with a yarmulke or a cross. Ibrahim, who was standing in for the Kohen Gadol, while Suleiman I was recuperating, started screaming at them to stop, but they didn't listen. The last time, the Pope had intervened with his magical abilities. This time, however, the worshippers wouldn't be as lucky. Ibrahim collapsed to the ground in a bloody heap as a bullet hit him in the chest. Just before his eyes closed forever, the Hamas assassin shouted that he and Suleiman had betrayed the true faith by letting infidels worship at the sacred shrine. Within a span of 15 minutes, the Hamas flag was flying over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Fluttering beneath it was the banner of Muslims for Humans, 1630 ZM/S Nordham Fort Lauderdale. The captain and first officer glanced at each other. Enough was enough. If they took on any more people, they'd probably crush each other to death. The captain pressed a button, and the gangplank began to retract back into the ship. Frantic people jumped for it, missed, and fell into the harbor. DeVries could hear the frantic pleading of the crowd, begging him to let more of them on. There wasn't anything more he could do, however. He started the engines and began moving out of the harbor towards the Atlantic. The first officer suddenly groaned. Unwilling to take his eyes off the controls, he asked Bernhard what had happened. Bernhard answered, "They've stenciled a new name on the side of the ship, Nohadam." DeVries swore. "Great, just great. 1703 Z Coolidge Corner, Brooklyn, Massachusetts, United States of America." The Sea Line light rail trolley car opened its doors and disgorged platoons of National Guard troops. The captain made a brief assessment of the situation and started deploying the droops. A good 10 men headed into the CVS to go after the looters who were trying to take all of the prescription drugs and food off the shelves. 7 or 8 headed down to a nearby church to beat off some Celestine hooligans. Others proceeded down Harvard Street to stop looting clothes from the various boutique fashion stores and food from the supermarkets. Still more headed towards an electronics store where people were merrily running away with television sets and expensive radios. The doors to the train closed, and it went express to Cleveland Circle, the end of the line. There, more troops flooded out to deal with angry Boston College students and panicking senior citizens. Some of them headed towards a crashing sound, which proved to be rioters overturning a car. The car had people in it and was in drive. Unfortunately, the traffic trying to get out of Boston was at a standstill, so it had nowhere to go. Chapter 216. Ragnarok in Diagon Alley. Monday, June 17, 1996, 3 days to Judgment Day 0044 Jarvard Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 1. Cup Atlantis alert status. DEFCON 2 * warning. Major character death. Normally, Jelena Kurchatova would have been elated at this letter. Not only had she been allowed to stay on in Russian House as the dormitory's new graduate residence tutor, she had been offered a position to teach 19, the introductory level magical technology course, which would soon become a requirement for all MIT students. Provided that the world didn't blow up beforehand, the lecture would make its first appearance in September. She would be teaching in 10250, one of the largest lecture halls in the school. She had taken several classes in there and hated to think what it would be like to have 500 people or more staring at you in front of the blackboard. She knew immediately that she would accept this position. Not only was she by far the most qualified person to teach it, she was, after all, a former MIT student, a witch, and a national heroine. She would be paid handsomely for her services, far above and beyond her normal graduate student stipend. Furthermore, she would not have to pay MIT rent for her one-bedroom apartment in Russian House. The only problem she had was that there weren't going to be many TARs available. Jason had offered to help, but he was still busy with school and didn't know much about magic. Guinevere had told her that she'd help out from time to time, possibly even serving as a substitute teacher if Jelena herself were to call in sick or be overwhelmed with her normal graduate work. The closest thing the course would be getting to TARS would be 3 or 4 displaced Greenwich residents who had been out of town when the sit had been destroyed. She had asked Secretary Radner for help, but Radner had brushed her off irritably, saying that he didn't have time to think about September. Neither did Jelena herself, as it turned out. At the moment, she was standing next to Guinevere in Harvard Square, surrounded by a large cordon of riot police. She had already petrificus totaloosed several people, breaking into convenience stores, and was currently in the process of going after some more. The National Guard troops, realizing that the petrificus totalis spell would incapacitate a person without harming them, had immediately holstered their taser guns and rubber bullets and left the 2 witches to deal with the troublemakers. Some idiot started playing 99 Luftballons by Nina on a boom box. Realizing that the popular 80s song was about nuclear war, Jelena aimed her wand at the radio and blasted it to smithereens. They had enough dealing with panicking people as it was. -0253 Z Diagon Alley. The security guard was jolted out of his power nap by a large number of staccato bursts indicating apparition arrivals. He counted at least 35 of them. Wondering who would be sneaking around in Diagon Alley this time of night, he put his hand on his wand and began warily watching the door. He never saw anything or heard anything. Half an hour later, he shrugged and went back to his power nap 256Z. Park Hae-chan, arms still aching from the application of the Death Eater tattoo, looked around the alley and tried to find a good place to hide. He eventually settled upon a location across the street from an art store called Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. It appeared to be a joke shop of some sort, and some of the things in that shop would probably serve as good distractions in case the Order of the Phoenix started getting the upper hand. -0923Z Chancellor's Office Berlingermany. The Chancellor of Germany never knew what hit him. He had been busy chatting with an Indian man in a business suit. The Indian was trying to convince him that it would be a good idea to at least hear what Chang Sung-teek had to say. If all else failed, it would at least buy time for the Germans to figure out how they were going to respond to the North Korean ultimatum. The influential German was caught completely off guard when a green beam shot out of a cane and hit him in the chest. Kneeling over his victim, the Indian plucked a few hairs off the man's head and put them in a little cup. He then vanished the body and walked into the bathroom with his cup. 5 minutes later, one of the Chancellor's assistants walked into the office, looking for him. Puzzled, the visitor started asking for the Chancellor. He was relieved when he heard the toilet flush and saw the Chancellor walk out of the bathroom and back into his office. The visitor breathed a sigh of relief, then chuckled. "Sir, you really shouldn't do that. When I saw you were missing, I suspected the worst. This isn't a good time to be playing practical jokes." The Chancellor slapped the palm of his hand against his head. "That's a good point, my friend. That was a bit of bad judgment on my part. How can I help you?" The visitor paused for a moment. He didn't think he'd ever heard the Chancellor call him my friend before. A bit odd. Looking at the Chancellor more closely, the visitor saw that the Chancellor had a little cup in his hand. Pointing at the cup, he asked, "Sir, I never knew you drank coffee." "Ha! The Chancellor looked at the cup blankly for a moment, then shrugged. I figured I needed a bit of a pick-me-up, given all of the long hours over the past week. At any rate, how can I help you? The two men then settled down for their meeting. The visitor had no idea that he was betraying state secrets to a Death Eater. -0941Z Beijing, China. The Chinese president admitted the representative from the north immediately. That proved to be a big mistake. 5 minutes later, the man was under the imperious charm. In one fell swoop, 1/6 of the world's population had come under Voldemort's rule, -1012 ZM/S Nordum. Michael DeVries screamed into the intercom. I don't care what you do. Just make sure that they don't do that. We weren't expecting to have 5,000 extra people on board who hadn't eaten before they left. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic. They're terrified, hungry, and are breaking into some of the stores in the center of the ship. It's only a matter of time until they reach the main food storage areas. Once they get all the food, they'll eat like Americans and drain us dry in 3 days. You're not going to let that happen, Geert. Station guards around the entrances and arm them. If necessary, shoot to injure. -1018 Z169 South Street, Waltham. The phone rang, and I walked into the bedroom to pick it up. Hello. It was my mother. Pack your stuff, Andy, and tell your boss. We're heading off to Curacao. I couldn't believe it. We're about to evacuate. How did you get the tickets? We had to pay $5,000 each for them. Thank God we had the money put away. Granted, we're going to have to go through places like St. Louis and Medellin to get there, and it will take 24 hours instead of the customary 9. However, the important thing is we're getting out. How are we going to meet up? The roads are impassable. I doubt I'll be able to drive to work with all the families trying to pick up the Brandeis students. Take the commuter rail in walk if necessary, and hope the tracks aren't blocked. We'll meet at the American Airlines terminal in 3 hours. -1029 Zeeth Leaky Cauldron, London. 1 minute to showtime. Reporters were everywhere. Helicopters were flying overhead, still abuzz with the reports that several highly armed and defended armored personnel carriers were converging on an obscure bar known as the Leaky Cauldron. They were accompanied by no fewer than 100 soldiers and at least 50 men and women in robes. The scene seemed to have been taken right out of Ghostbusters. People were either panicking, praying, or cheering on the assault force. Someone even started playing Saving the Day, the song from the movie's soundtrack, which was performed when the Ghostbusters were converging on the hotel at the movie's climax. The proprietor of the Leaky Cauldron had left the building immediately after the assault force had arrived. Fortunately for him, they had not been forced to raise the pub in order to get the apps through to Diagon Alley. The vehicles in question, along with their occupants, were now about the size of toy cars. They had been shrunk so they would be able to enter Diagon Alley without knocking the walls down. They would revert to their usual size at least to the width of the alley, once they passed through the door. Albus Dumbledore looked at Rufus Scrimgeour. Drawing a deep breath, he said, "If this is the last time I get to speak to you, I would like to confess that it's been an honor serving with you." Scrimgeour shook his hand. "The feeling is mutual, Albus. However, don't worry. We'll get through to the Horcrux. I can feel it." All eyes were on the clock. After what appeared to be an eternity, the minute hand finally reached the Roman 6 at the bottom. Everyone cheered, and the apps started up their engines as Dumbledore began searching for the appropriate bricks. Meanwhile, the head of the Muggle forces roared, "Let's get ready to rumble." 1029 Weasley's Wizard Diagon Alley. Fred Weasley watched from outside Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. There were about 60 seconds before all hell was going to break loose. He longed to help the Order of the Phoenix fight off any Death Eaters and destroy the final Horcrux. Unfortunately, Dumbledore's orders had been explicit. Both he and George, at least one of them, had to mind the store to make sure that none of the Death Eaters managed to break in and steal things which would mess around with the Order's objectives. All the Death Eaters needed to do would be to get their hands on things like Peruvian instant darkness powder, and the offensive would bog down in a hurry. Fred had an uneasy feeling that the two brothers hadn't been vigilant enough in their checks. By the time they had completed their inventory assessment, a half hour after they had unlocked the doors, they had made the disturbing discovery that a portable swamp, a bag of Peruvian darkness powder, some wildfire whiz-bangs, a box of decoy detonators, 5 extendable ears, 3 jumping snakes, and a whole rack of shield hats had mysteriously disappeared. This likely meant that a Death Eater had been watching the store and marched in under a disillusionment charm or invisibility cloak, while both brothers were attending to customers. Fred recalled the caterwauling charm going off shortly after the store opened. They had used the spell as a primitive burglar alarm. At the time, they had passed it off as a false alarm. There had been many of those of late. Now, however, he wasn't sure it had been a false alarm. Fred hoped people wouldn't pay for this mistake with their lives. He was still contemplating this problem when he noticed an odd discoloration near the entrance to Diagon Alley. Suspicious, he brought out his binoculars to take a closer look. His jaw dropped when he realized what it was. It was the missing portable swamp, and it was blocking the entrance to the alley 1030Z. The caterwauling charm went off seconds after the First Order member walked through the door into Diagon Alley. The man stiffened in surprise, which left him easy prey for an Avada Kedavra cast from just inside an empty storefront. There went the surprise, Dumbledore thought. He was in the process of sending the apks through the opening when he heard an odd splash. The dead man had fallen into a swamp. Dumbledore blinked. A swamp. Since well had Diagon Alley had a swamp in it. Then it hit him. Either the Weasleys had defected, or more likely, the Death Eaters had broken into the joke shop and raided the place. He shuddered to think of the possibility that the Death Eaters had preempted his joke shop tactic by either taking over the store and killing Fred and George, or stealing all of the interesting stuff before the Order got there. There was a shout, and Dumbledore saw Fred Weasley, or was it George, running in his direction and pointing at the swamp in irritation. It was obvious that the brothers had been robbed. Dumbledore was about to ask him how to get rid of it when a green beam hit whichever twin it was in the chest, and down he went. This was followed by an instant flurry of decoy detonators from inside the store. Whoever had killed the Weasley boy was distracted by the detonators and started shooting wildly. This gave the surviving twin a chance to hit the man with a red beam, and the Death Eater went down. The Muggle commander, still in the leaky cauldron, took one look at the swamp and swore. "Those trees are in the way, Wizard Dumbledore. The apks aren't going to be able to enter the alley, and we're dead meat if we can't get the apks in there and batter our way in. Can you disrupt the enchantment, or at least destroy the trees? Meanwhile, everyone get under your invisibility cloaks and shield cloaks and get out there. Whatever you do, don't get hit by any of those beams." Dumbledore moved out of the way and grinned as a curse slammed into the sphere of invincibility provided by the Atlantis great serpent ring on his finger. High-ranking wizards who had served on Atlantis were given these rings, but were only allowed to use them in case of emergency when Atlantis was at a level of DEFCON 2 or higher. He never thought he'd have to use it, but this was certainly an emergency, and Dialonis had declared DEFCON 2. The ring would protect only him, however. Furthermore, he would not be permitted to attack while wearing the ring unless Atlantis went to DEFCON 1. The rules, however, did permit him to provide cover for someone who wanted to cast a finite spell at the portable swamp from inside the leaky cauldron. 5 bolts crashed into the shield as the invisible Muggles raced out of the pub and began establishing a beachhead. One of the Muggles let loose with a machine gun, and Dumbledore heard a scream as a Death Eater wearing an invisibility cloak was hit. The man behind him shouted, and Dumbledore veered out of the way to allow a yellow beam to burst through the opening and into the portable swamp. The swamp shimmered and disappeared seconds before someone further down the alley shouted, "Akio machine guns." Half the Muggles shouted in horror as their guns suddenly flew out of their hands and into those of the Death Eaters. This was getting ugly, and within a matter of seconds, 3 bullets had slammed into Dumbledore's shield, and 6 of the Order's own invisible Muggles had gone down. However, their luck would change momentarily. Nodding to the Muggle commander, he moved out of the way so that the Muggles could send the apks through. The first apk ballooned to its normal size almost immediately after it cleared Dumbledore's shield. The assault team quickly entered formation behind it. Death Eaters shouted in shock and aimed their newly acquired machine guns at the vehicle, but the carrier's armor was impenetrable. That was when one of the wizards had the idea that he could vaporize the vehicle with a blast from his wand. The result stunned and horrified the Death Eaters. As far as they could tell, nothing, absolutely nothing known to man could disrupt such a powerful spell. Yet the app shrugged it off without any problems. Unknown to them, Sirius Black had instructed the Muggles to enchant all 3 vehicles with fields which would convert any magic in them to electricity, the reverse of the spell which had been used to adapt the computer in Hogwarts to magic. This did nothing to stop the spell, of course, and the app was struck with a powerful electric bolt with the intensity of a lightning blast. The personnel carriers, however, were hardened against EMP, as was usually the case with military vehicles. The electricity cascaded around the metal sides of the vehicle and into the ground. There was a howl of terror from further down the street. Several more people fired on the app, also in vain. That was when the app opened up with its own machine guns. Death Eaters fell everywhere. Someone shouted something in Korean further down the alley, and the people in the app reported that their infrared scanners, which appeared to be picking up invisible people, as well no wizard had ever thought of blocking her before, were showing the Death Eaters backing up and regrouping. This was what the Order had been looking for. The lead app began heading on the alley towards Gringotts, with the assault team members shielded from the Death Eaters by the simple fact that the vehicle took up virtually the entire width of the alley, and as a result, nothing could get through. The second app resumed its normal size outside the doorway. Scrimgeour shrieked an order, and Ministry of Magic personnel began casting spells. Unlike the first app, this vehicle could be enchanted from beneath. Slowly but surely, the app gently lifted into the air so it could fire on the enemy without hitting the vehicle in front of it. Perched in the hatch was Sirius Black, HMSS, now familiar with both Muggle and wizarding military tactics and weapons. Cheering wildly, the rest of the assault team raced into Diagon Alley now that they were blocked from enemy attack above them, in front of them, and behind them. A third spun 180 degrees and fired in the general direction of the leaky cauldron, making sure to not actually shoot through the opening into the pub. The rest started firing wildly into the buildings. Scrimgeour had instructed all of the shops in Diagon Alley to close early, at 11:00, in order to prevent civilians from being hit. Several Death Eaters were caught trying to sneak up behind the assault team and were blown to bits. 3 or 4 more were hit shooting curses out of store windows. The 2 apps moved ahead as the assault team hurried forward to keep up with the defensive screen. A few seconds later, there was another flash as the third app, this one fully shielded and containing Draco Malfoy, Severus Snape, McGonagall, and the rest of the actual Gringotts assault team, reverted to its normal size. The assault team was now completely protected on all sides. As long as they mowed down all the Death Eaters in the storefronts, absolutely nothing would be able to stop them, presuming that Voldemort's men didn't have some more tricks up their sleeves. Considering that whichever Weasley had been killed had been extremely irritated, Dumbledore suspected that the portable swamp had not been the only thing stolen from the joke shop. The person in charge of the third app rotated the gun turret 180 degrees so that it would be able to go after anyone who tried to sneak up on the assault team from behind. Slowly but surely, The world's first combined Muggle magical battering ram made its way down Diagon Alley towards Gringotts, 1032 Zoval Office White House. Travis Radner walked into the Oval Office. He didn't mince words. "Mr. President, the assault team has made its way into Diagon Alley and is proceeding towards Gringotts. They've encountered some Death Eater resistance, but so far everything is going according to plan." Clinton nodded. "Good work, Mr. Radner. I take it they'll have that, what is it, Horcrux, out of the way soon." "I believe so. Sir, alert the coalition forces stationed in North Korea and tell them to stand by and go on full alert. As soon as that Horcrux falls, we strike. Meanwhile, I'll go to England and tell Professor Slughorn to send over his surprise package." Clinton grunted. "Surprise package." Radner chuckled. "That is correct, so let's say that our forces are going to get lucky. Very lucky." 1033 Z Diagon Alley. Park Hae-chan couldn't believe what he was seeing. One of his strongest spells, designed by Voldemort himself, had done no damage to the Muggle vehicle. This was not good. Not good at all. At least Draco Malfoy had gotten the Horcrux out of there before the attack began. He didn't know what exactly was coming at him. However, whatever it was huge and not particularly friendly. He saw two vehicles working their way down the alley. One of them was floating in midair so that it could fire its weapon without hitting the one in the vanguard of the formation. He suspected that the Muggles he had seen earlier were either in other vehicles or walking behind them. It was time to regroup and think of other options. He whistled and shouted, "Everybody fall back. It seems that these vehicles are immune to magic. We're going to have to interfere in some other ways. Get Galgamath and the rest of the giants out here. Perhaps they're strong enough to pick up these vehicles or crush them. Dig holes in the ground which will make it so that they can't proceed any further. Get the dragons to breathe on the vehicles. Finally, stand by in Nocturne Alley to lower the glass screen so that the basilisk can see the attacking forces. Remember, once that happens, do not look down there." He would have loved to allow the basilisk to actually attack the enemy. Unfortunately, Death Eaters were no more immune to the creature's stare as other people, and as a result, it had to stay safely in hiding. There was a squeal of brakes as the lead app suddenly ground to a halt. Dumbledore, puzzled, ordered someone to send a Patronus up there to see what was going on. A few seconds later, it returned. Dumbledore shook his head and reported its findings to the rest of the group. "It looks like the Death Eaters have changed tactics. They've excavated a deep hole in the street that the app can't cross. It sounds like they're either trying to force us down Nocturne Alley, which I wouldn't recommend, or trying to make it so we can't go any further." Sirius, inside the tank, nodded grimly. "Well, we've got an answer for that. Send the second app out in front to provide cover so that our engineers and wizards can plug the hole. Once that's done, it can go back into position and continue towards Gringotts. Raise a force field to protect the troops while the app is not there, and tell the one in the back to focus on threats from above as long as the troops are exposed." The app had just completed its maneuver to the front of the convoy when Dumbledore heard some explosions off in Nocturne Alley. He was about to turn his head to see what was going on when he recognized the sound FRMO, his experience at Hogwarts. Decoy detonators, one of the specialties from the joke shop. He warned everyone to ignore them. However, several of the Muggles looked down the alley to see what was going on. That proved to be a very big mistake. Dumbledore watched in horror as the people suddenly froze, turned to stone, and exploded in puffs of dust. Dumbledore recognized the symptoms immediately. Basilisk. This was not good. He screamed at the top of his lungs. "There's a basilisk down that alley. Whatever you do, don't look at it. Sirius, we need help here." Sirius's Patronus reported back, "I can't. We've got a couple of giants in the way now here, and they still need to plug the Merlin's beard. Is that a dragon heading towards us? I'm calling in the chopper. It's a trap. Call in the backup still in the leaky cauldron and tell them to take cover in the stores. We don't want them in the open. Tell them to bring out their RPGs. One of them is to shoot the weapon at the dragon. We need to buy time for that chopper to get over here." The Muggles had no idea what Nocturne Alley was and didn't react too badly at the mention of the basilisk. However, they knew what dragons were, and this one was coming from above while the troops were exposed. Not surprisingly, several of them panicked. 5 more of them turned to face the alley and were killed. Dumbledore grabbed one man with an RPG. "Soldier, listen to me. Aim your weapon down that alley, but aim by looking at the end of the alley where it meets this one. Do not look down the alley and assume your target is 4 feet tall or so. Shoot." The soldier glanced at his commanding officer, who nodded. He fired the weapon down the alley and was rewarded with an explosion and the sound of tinkling glass. This was followed by a stentorian slithering sound as the basilisk, finally freed from its glass cage, began moving down the alley towards its prey. "Wonderful," Dumbledore thought. "We just let it out." A couple of wizards instinctively looked to the sound and were killed. He shouted at the man with the RPG once more. "Fire again. Finish it off." The soldier did so. There was a second explosion, followed by an agonized howl which quickly trailed off into a death rattle. A couple of Muggles looked down into the alley and whistled. "What was that? A snake? All I see are pieces." The fact that the Muggles had survived was proof enough that the basilisk had been destroyed. He was in the process of congratulating the soldier when 2 things happened simultaneously. First, there was a horrible reptilian shriek, this time from above. Then the sky above the assault team caught fire as dragon breath slammed into the force field protecting the troops. People gasped for breath as the flames consumed all the oxygen. Dumbledore watched in shock as people outside his Atlantis bubble put their hands to their mouths. He had forgotten about that effect. He heard someone in the rear apk firing the machine gun at something. The dragons screamed in pain and the flame subsided. The soldiers could breathe again. Seconds later, the dragon's howl was drowned out by another whoosh as someone in the back fired another RPG at it. There was an explosion far above, followed by a huge crash, followed by the distinctive sound of crumbling masonry. Sirius's Patronus materialized in front of Dumbledore. "The dragon's gone." However, it fell between the rear apk and the reinforcements, hitting one of the buildings as it came down. The reinforcements' progress seems to be blocked by a combination of dead reptile and rubble. Dumbledore swore under his breath. "Tell them to clean everything up as fast as they can and rejoin us." 1037Z. Alistair Moody had his own problems at the front of the convoy. Although the hole in the street was just about patched, there were a couple of other obstacles in the way. These obstacles, however, were mobile and over 20 feet tall. He had thought Hagrid was big. These fellows were around twice his size and a good 10 times meaner. He looked nervously at those big meaty fists. He wouldn't be surprised if one of those would be strong enough to stave in a side of the apk. One of those things traveling at punch speed would probably pack a serious wallop. He had tried casting spells on them, but they were too strong. Machine guns did little more than irritate them and tell everyone where he was. He tried to think of what to do as he caught sight of another invisible Death Eater with his magical eye. He pointed sharply, and the gunner swiveled the machine gun in its direction. Down went the Death Eater. One of the giants thrust his hand into a building. When he withdrew it, he was holding one of the support columns of Zonkos, a good 10 feet long and 4 feet wide. Zonkos collapsed in a heap as the giant raised it over his head. Shit, Moody thought. There was only one thing worse than a punch traveling at 50 mph. A 2-ton steel rod traveling at 50 mph. The giant never got a chance to throw it, however. He was in the process of throwing the column when he suddenly exploded. Moody's magical eye managed to catch a brief glimpse of the missile as it had come in. The weapon had come in from above, which probably meant that the chopper was approaching. By the time the smoke had cleared, both giants were down. Less than 100 feet beyond them was the headquarters of Gringotts. He could barely see it through the dissipating smoke. Thank God these things had treads, Moody thought. The vehicles continued their steady advance, climbing over the bodies of the giants 1043Z. Park Hae-chan swore as the Death Eaters began to get overwhelmed. This was not fair, he thought. They've got rocket launchers, helicopters, and God knows what else. Well, they still had to get into Gringotts. He told everyone to retreat into Gringotts and prepare for the last stand, 1046Z. The three apks reached Gringotts, and things began to happen fast. The first two vehicles spun 180 degrees and positioned themselves to the left and right of the main entrance, firing at everything with a Death Eater mask, scales, or wings. Moody cheered as the reinforcements finished cleaning away the carcass of the dragon and rejoined them. His jubilation turned to horror as two things happened simultaneously. The world went black as someone activated some Peruvian instant darkness powder, and the reinforcements suddenly started screaming about snakes attacking them in all directions. He just hoped that the reinforcements would get out of this all right. The helicopter reported that it could still see the battlefield through the goggles. The helicopter would take care of this battlefield, he thought. We've reached Gringotts. It's time to proceed to Phase 2. They had originally planned to go in under the cover of invisibility. Now it seemed that they wouldn't even need to bother with the invisibility cloaks, thanks to the darkness powder. Moody whistled, and the third apk, the important one, suddenly spun around as well and began backing towards the main entrance. Within a minute, all three apks were in position, creating an impregnable wall which would prevent any Death Eaters still outside the bank from proceeding further. All of the infantry units immediately hurried into the bank. Moody watched as some of them fell. Eventually, though, they reported the coast was clear as far as they could tell. A few minutes later, they sent back word that they had established a beachhead. It was now or never. The third apk's rear door opened to reveal Severus Snape, Draco Malfoy, McGonagall, and several other people. Dumbledore joined them, followed by a good half of the Aurors. The way was open. Draco looked at Dumbledore one last time. "I want to help, Professor. I want my revenge." Dumbledore stared at him firmly. "No, Draco. You're underage and will stay in the apks under our protection. You're not strong enough to fight Death Eaters, even if you know them." "No, but Draco. This decision is final. I'm sorry. If we need your help in getting into the vault, we'll come and get you." Draco grumbled for a moment but went silent. He could wait. It wasn't as if they could get in without him, after all. And if all else failed, he could take advantage of any lapse in their security by relaying the Order's plans to the Death Eaters.